Hey everyone, this is Ben Bodkin. Thank you so much for joining me for this screencast. Today we're going to be talking about Berlin Percussion and also doing a little walkthrough of a demo that I wrote for this library a few years ago called Race to the Ocean. So what I was trying to accomplish here basically at the time Berlin Brass had not been released yet, nor had the Metropolis Arc choirs, but there was Berlin Strings, there was Berlin Woodwinds, and there was Berlin Percussion. So I tried to create a symphonic orchestral kind of partly action piece using as much Berlin orchestra as I could. And I'm filling in the gaps in the brass. And back when I did this with a Cine Brass Core and Hollywood Brass. And the choir from it's the Requiem Light Choir. So anyways, what I'm going to do today is I'll start with just playing through this piece of music. We'll talk a little bit about Berlin Percussion and what it is and what it's good for. And then I'm going to talk a little bit also about some of the orchestration things that I'm doing in here, because there's actually some interesting color and doubling stuff that I'm doing in this piece that might be interesting to talk about. So let me go ahead and I'm going to open in the MIDI roll all the tonal parts. I'm not going to include the atonal percussion because that will just visually muddy what we're seeing. I think that's pretty much everything. Okay. And I'll just do a playthrough of the whole piece like this, and then we'll talk about it more. So let's go ahead and listen to it. This is Race to the Ocean. Alrighty, so there's that. Fortunately, we had a little bit of a skip or something there at the end. Some of that percussion is a little delayed too, that cymbal roll. I'm not sure exactly why that is. But anyway, you can get the basic gist of the piece from listening to that. So let's talk about what we've got here. I told you briefly what we have library-wise. So what I wanted to do in this cue is basically show off Berlin Percussion as much as I could. But with orchestral percussion, it's often playing a supporting role or an accenting role or creating flourishes and that kind of stuff in the context of a larger symphonic piece. So that's why I would decide I would do something kind of actiony, something that could use a whole bunch of percussion but is not, it's not straight percussion. Some of these instruments are tonal, like a xylophone. The cowbells actually they got these like tuned cowbells. It's actually one of my favorite little instruments in this library. It's just kind of unconventional. But, you know, I had a fever and I needed some more cowbell, so there's the cowbell. Anyway, so I think what I'll start by doing is I'll just talk a little bit about what this library comes with and what's included. So let me see here. Let's go ahead and pull this up. So Berlin Percussion, this is Orchestral Tools' flagship orchestral percussion library. And it's different. You know, one question you might be having is, okay, it's Orchestral Tools, so you know it's going to be pretty good, but there's also a lot of other companies out there like Spitfire and Cinesamples who have their own orchestral percussion libraries. So how is this one different? How is this one unique? What does this really mean? Well, first off, this is an orchestral tools library through and through. So this is a orchestral percussion library with a coat and tails on. Okay, so there's not going to be any epic taikos, no epic trailer percussion. This is, you're going to the symphony kind of library. It's very detailed and it's also very deep. So there's a lot of nuancy things. So let's just take a look. Okay, there's the drums, bass drums, snare drums. If you go ahead and open one of these up, you'll see, oh, snare drums. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of snare drums. There's like 5 or 6 different kinds of snare drum, not just one. So there's a lot of detail there, a lot of depth. There's also 5 microphone positions on, I think, everything. So your spot mics, close mics, AB, tree, and surround mics. And you can use these to capture, you know, create pretty much any kind of sound that you want. This is recorded in the Teldex Hall in Berlin, which is a great sounding place, and it's where the other main orchestral tools libraries were recorded. So sonically it blends very nicely with Berlin brass, Berlin woodwinds, Berlin strings, etc. So that's one of the reasons why you would get this library versus some other ones is if you have a Orchestral Tools heavy template, this is an in-depth, detailed orchestral percussion library that just gels very nicely with that. So without going through every patch, you can see more information on the Orchestral Tools website, which I will link to down below. There's a lot of stuff, mallets and keys, vibraphone, marimba. There's also multiple types of mallets on most of the mallet instruments. Let's go to unpitched metals, cymbals. There's so many different kinds of cymbals and cymbal multis and so many different kinds of scrapes and brushes and rolls that you're probably going to be basically covered. If you get this as an orchestral percussion library, it's kind of going to cover all your bases. Now, when it comes to orchestral percussion libraries in general, I don't know that there's anything about this library that is particularly groundbreaking or super unique, other than just the fact that it's done in the Teldex Hall. It has the Berlin sound, it has the Orchestral Tools approach. It's very detailed. It's very deep. A lot of microphone positions, a lot of round robins, and just a whole lot of options. Toms. We got 4 different kinds of toms. Cymbals. I mean, there's a bunch of kind of uncommon and unconventional orchestral percussion that might be used, you know, in this unusual symphonic piece, but you know they recorded it also. There's a lot of percussive toys and stuff. So it's all focused on the symphonic orchestra. One thing that I should mention is that this Berlin Percussion main library does not come with any timpani. And the reason for that is because Orchestral Tools has a dedicated timpani library. So that's pretty much the only thing I would consider a glaring omission in this library when it comes to just like an all-round orchestral percussion library, is that the timpani are a separate purchase. And that's not really a knock against the library. It's just something you should be aware of if you're going to go purchase this. Now, how do I use this library? Well, what I like to do is basically set my orchestral template up. So I go through and talking cymbals, for example. I'm going to go through all the cymbal sounds, and I'm going to find the rolls and the hits and the patches that I like the most. I'm going to load those up into my template, and then for the most part, I'm not going to worry about all the rest of this stuff again. So I have my my orchestral percussion template pretty much set up here, and I like to just have it set up, and I don't really want to go through and look for specific kinds of cymbal scrape and all that stuff. I like to just have the patches that I like all ready to go. Now, that's just the way I think. So when it comes to orchestral percussion libraries, for the most part, I'm not looking for something super special. I'm not necessarily looking for something really revolutionary. I just want something that represents all the orchestral percussion sounds well, is recorded well, fits sonically with the other things that I'm using well. And so this library really fits the ticket. If anything, it's actually way, way deeper than I need it to be in terms of the number of articulations, the number of different kinds of cymbal, different kinds of tom, etc. But it's if you need like a bread and butter orchestral percussion library that has all your bases covered, except timpani, it's a separate purchase, then this is basically going to cover all your bases. And it's going to be flexible enough with your multiple microphone positions that you can probably get it to match just about any sound that you need to. So that's kind of what it is, and if somebody came up to me and said, hey, I want to buy one Orchestral Tools library and I want to fill out the rest of my template with some other developer sounds, like if you were going to get one OT library, what would it be? I wouldn't say Berlin Percussion first. I'd probably say Berlin Woodwinds, maybe Berlin Brass, or some of the Metropolis Arcs libraries. So this is kind of a second fiddle. No, that's not the right term. But this is a library that basically complements other ones. So if you need like a really good a library that just represents the entire orchestra very that was messy. It's afternoon. It's the afternoon. My brain is starting to perish. If you need a orchestral percussion library that covers all the bases very well and kind of future-proofs you for all your basic orchestral percussion needs, then this is going to do it. And also, if you're already in the Orchestral Tools environment a lot, then this is probably the orchestral percussion route that makes sense to go. Now, if your template is heavy in Spitfire or mostly Cinesamples, that might give you reason to lean towards their orchestral percussion options over this one. So anyway, those are just some basic thoughts about the library. As you can see in this piece, there's a lot of percussion going on. I don't know how many actual percussionists you would need to perform this piece in a live orchestra, but it's quite a few. Let me go ahead and just isolate some of the percussion so we can hear just what the percussion is doing in a short sequence. Let's listen to just this bit here. Celeste and Glockenspiel. We got some stuff here near the end. Xylophones going at it. Got some Piatti cymbals. These are really nice. I really like those. So basically, it's just solid orchestral percussion. Now, as probably a lot of you know, orchestral percussion is usually filling a supplementary role and is not as front and center as, say, strings, brass, and woodwinds are. So I'm going to move on from talking specifically about Berlin percussion, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the orchestration things that I'm doing in this piece. First, I start off with everything in this piece is very triadic. I'm doing this interesting voicing thing. This is just straight triads, violins and violas. And then an octave below, we have trumpets and trombones basically doing the exact same thing. Solo that so you can hear that. Very Stravinsky-esque. Just straight minor triads, but I'm moving all over the place, not staying at one tonal center. A note on brass. As you'll see, this is just trumpets and trombones, no French horns, no tubas. And the reason for that is, different instruments have a very different timbre. Trumpet and trombone are much more similar in timbre than the horns and the tubas, which are much mellower. So if I want something that's really bright and really has some bite to it, I'm probably going to want to voice it like this. I'm gonna want to maybe keep my horns out of the way. Just go trombones, go trumpets, and if I want a bass note in here, I probably won't go tuba. I'll probably go bass trombone or chimbassi, which has a similar characteristic to the trumpets and the trombones. It has a similar, very bright sound. And this is Cinebrass, which is great for this kind of stuff. Got a couple brass effects, courtesy of Hollywood Brass. Another thing about this piece is there's a whole lot of doubling. There's a whole lot of mixing of different colors together to create new sounds or interesting flavor combinations. One thing I want to open up is this. I want to open up and show you what I have there. This is, let's see what we got. We have violins 1 and 2, spiccato, I believe. Doing this an octave apart. I've also got a piccolo run, a fast runs transition patch from Berlin Woodwinds on that same sequence, as well as these crotales, or actually I don't know how to pronounce that. So let's listen and see what we get with these in combination. So why did I do that? There's a couple reasons. One is I like the sound. I like the sound of these elements in combination. I wanted it to pierce through, so I wanted to put the crotales on there just because they pierce through so hard. I also wanted to add a little bit more of a slurring quality to the performance, because if you listen to just these string spiccatos, it doesn't have as much of a hasty, messy as I wanted it to achieve. So it still sounds a little bit more like individual notes than I want it to. Now, one thing I'm kind of surprised I didn't do, because there's actually a blurred staccato patch in Berlin strings, which is great for this kind of thing. If you just have like a regular spiccato patch and then double that with the blurred staccato at like half of its volume, you would basically get that effect. Now, for whatever reason, I didn't do that. Maybe I didn't know that hack yet. So one of the things that I do to kind of slur this performance a little more, make it feel a little bit messier and a little bit less like it's really distinct individual notes, is to add this piccolo runs transition patch in there with it, and then the crotales. I really need to learn how to pronounce that so I'm not embarrassing myself every time I talk about it. And I think the overall effect is, it works pretty good. It sounds pretty realistic to my ears. Now there's a really interesting thing that happens here that I didn't remember doing on purpose the first time, when I composed this piece. And so it kind of surprised me when I looked at my MIDI, but it's very interesting. It's a trick I think I'm going to try to use again in the future. But as I was looking at this little da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, this little chromatic movement upwards, I noticed my brass and my strings are offset by a half step. They're not in sync. So let's listen to it. So I saw that and I thought, oh my goodness, I can't believe I missed that. I can't believe, that's so wrong. But as I was listening to it and I was thinking, I really like how it sounds. Why does that work? Because it seems like it shouldn't work, and it seems like looking at it, it would sound way messier than it actually sounds. But I think what's happening is the brass are much more dominant. It's a much brighter sound. It's also a louder sound. So I think what's happening is your ear hears these pitches as the dominant ones, and the strings, which are offset by 1/2 step, your ear is not picking up as the dominant pitch. But it's creating like a halfways cluster effect, which it feels hasty and it feels kind of rushed, which is I kind of wanted on this piece. So if I actually drag these down so that they're in, on the same notes as the brass, I realized I wasn't liking the effect as much. So like these strings at a much lower volume combined with the brass, it makes a nice like halfway cluster effect. And one thing that's interesting about tonality and atonality is it's not quite as black and white sometimes as either it's tonal or it's atonal. There's degrees in between, something that might be perfectly consonant and something that's totally dissonant. And you can use a little bit of dissonance just to get someone out of the comfort zone of what they anticipate hearing. So anyway, this is a trick I'm probably going to be coming back to just to offset in a really big piece like this, to offset some of the elements by a little bit, just to create, it's kind of like tiny clusters, but within the order of this very clear chromatic triads moving up. So let's listen to that one more time. So I thought that was interesting. Another thing I want to look at is woodwinds. This bit here, I really like that ensemble sound. What you have here is a flute legato, alto flute legato, oboe and clarinet. These are all solos, and they're all playing the same line. If I was going to do this again, I can see what I did was just a simple copy paste. I made one line and I just copy and pasted it. If I was going to do this again, I would probably do at least 2 different passes so that the performance is slightly different and the timing is slightly different, so it doesn't sound quite as uniform, and that way it would feather the beginnings and the ends of the notes a little more and make it sound a little bit more like an ensemble and a little bit less like a single instrument that's just kind of hard to place. But something I don't hear in a lot of film music today is woodwinds playing melodies in unison. I hear a lot of, it's very common for woodwinds to be doing some kinds of effects like runs, maybe doing some chords, or for a solo instrument like a flute or an oboe to carry the melody for a bit over some strings or something. But in a lot of like older symphonic writing and like really classic sort of neo-romantic stuff, there's a lot of this woodwinds doubling on melody, or doublings in octaves, or doublings in octaves with strings, or doubling in octaves with brass. And so that's something you should just remember for your own toolkit, for your own future orchestration, is you can make some really cool sounds just by combining a bunch of different instruments together on the same line, either in different octaves or in the same octave like we have here. Well, that's just flute. And then in octaves. And in case you're wondering, these woodwinds they're not from the Berlin Woodwinds main or Revive library. These are from the Soloists, I think Soloists 1 library, which used to be called Berlin Woodwinds Expansion B, which is kind of a mouthful. All right, let's move on. Let's see if there's anything else that's interesting to talk about. Oh, yeah. I'm going to stop right there. Okay, so for this section, this is kind of like the big orchestral, everyone all together for the final verse, so to speak, of this piece. So we've got a lot of different instruments going. We've got first and second violins, violas. I'm using a Berlin Strings all strings patch, which is it's a nice all strings patch. This is a little cheat that I sometimes do. Usually I try to arrange for strings using the appropriate ensemble for that part. But sometimes if the strings are just playing, basically reinforcing the chords in the background, sometimes I'll use an all strings patch, which is usually, it's double bass down below, and then cello, and then violas and violins working in. But often for like the lower end, instead of actually splitting it up for double bass, cello, and violas, sometimes I'll just use an all strings patch for that lower end. And you can see here, I'm using it there for basically what you're getting is double basses and cello an octave apart, which is probably how I would voice it if I was doing these parts individually. The sound is slightly different because you're probably getting double basses here and double basses here. But in a big piece like this where there's a lot of different elements, this sounds pretty good, and it's very functional. So this is kind of a hack shortcut that I sometimes use. So this is where the cello and bass parts is in this all strings patch. So anyway, we have a lot going on. We got all of our strings. We've actually got a few different first violin parts. So I'm kind of cheating a little bit. I'm using more violins than there actually would be in a regular orchestra. We've got on woodwinds, at this big moment, we have, what do we have? Flute trills, the 8VA, which I think is 2 flutes, and then a piccolo 1 octave above. I think that's what this patch is. So those are doing some trills, some major trills. And trills are a really nice way in orchestral music, like string trills or woodwind trills, a really nice way to add texture. The minor trill, which is the smaller trill, can create more of a sense of tension and unease, but the wider trill, the whole step trill, which is what I have here, has, to be simplistic, more of a beautiful sound and like a very swimmy sound. So I like to use it in pieces like this. Another thing that's neat is that chordal trills, which I have here at the very end. While we're talking about techniques, I'll just go ahead and talk about this. It's that one and that one. At the very end, I switch. So that is a violins 1, a major chord, but doing a major trill. So basically what will end up happening is it's alternating at the speed of the trill. It's alternating between B major and C sharp major, which basically creates a Lydian effect, which is the Lydian mode is kind of like the sound of orchestral adventure, kind of like 90s soundtracks. So basically the chordal, a major chordal trill is inherently Lydian, and just like it instantly evokes that sound. I mean, this is just like so perfect. You know, you're gonna hop in a bike and fly over the moon when you hear that sound. So anyway, like I said, we have a lot of different things going on. All the strings are working. We've got a number of woodwinds working, not all the woodwinds. We've got brass. It's actually some nice brass chords here. Center brass, by the way, is really nice. The chords, it's really nice for chords. The legatos are nice too, but this is kind of a nice, clean, open, warm brass sound. Now, just a note here, I was watching what I'm doing here is also something would be unconventional in a regular score, but this is a trick I learned from watching a video by Mike Patty about this patch. The tuba and bass trombone patch is great for low stuff. You know, obviously, but up in this sort of upper like cello register. It's got a really warm sound. Usually I would, if I wanted that warm sound up there, I'd be using French horns. But this sounds really nice, so why not do this? We're using our tubas and bass trombones way up here, basically at middle C, but it sounds nice, so why not do it? So that's these really nice big brass chords are just that patch, and then I'm filling out the upper end of the chord with 2-note trumpet. This is really nice voicing at the end here. Just very clear, very open, very basic. But you know what? Your voicing doesn't always have to be complicated. Sometimes it needs to be basic and be strong. So we've got, I think the last point I'm going to make, I'll just finish up this thought. And we've also got a choir in here. It's not super loud, but it's basically reinforcing these chords. And then we got all of this, we've got all this crazy percussion stuff happening. So there's a lot of different instruments here. I mean, I don't know, 40 different tracks maybe. But something I want to point out that in pretty much every piece of music, there's a limited number of musical elements that are actually happening at the same time. So if you look at this piece of music and you break it down, there's only about 6 things happening, depending on how you divide it up. First off, we've got our melody, okay? Melody is first and second violins in octaves. This is Berlin strings. So that's all we have on melody. We got melody, that's one element. We've got a sort of a counter melody, kind of a call and answer thing, and that's the French horns. So this sort of thing. So there's 2 elements, melody and our counter melody thing. with the French horns. Then we've got our chords, just our basic chords, and our bass, which you could say maybe is two different things. We've got tremolo violins. On chords, we have tremolo violins. We have this all strings patch. We have all of our brass. We have our choir. And that's basically what we've got on. And we've got this woodwind trill, the flute trills. And so we've got our chords. And that's not moving hardly at all. There's a little bit of movement in the trumpets that leads us into the next chord. But it's just sustaining. It's just holding. It's just filling the space with our big, nice, warm sound that we need to have here at the end. So this is our third and fourth elements, our chords and our bass notes, which one criticism I have of this arrangement now, a few years later, is I would go back, I would make sure that the bass notes were stronger and a little bit louder. But you can see it. We've got the strings, cello, and double bass, and that big tuba and bass trombone patch on this B. Is our root of that chord. So what did we just say? We have melody, we have a counter melody, we have chords, we have our bass note, and then two more elements. We have percussive accents. So we have our piatti symbol here, this zildjian, again, however you say that. We have a bass drum, and these chimes, and these basically serve as percussive accents. And then our sixth and final element is rhythmic motion, or rhythmic texture. So there's two different kinds of rhythmic texture happening in this piece. We have a violin spiccatissimo patch, which is like a super short, a staccatissimo, super short staccato. And xylophones, they're doing this. And then we have crotals and flute runs doing kind of the same sweepy thing. And so that's what's providing our motion. We have our consistent rhythmic motion that's moving us forward. So between those, basically we've got melody, counter melody, chords, bass, percussive accents, and then rhythmic, rhythmic motion and texture. And pretty much all pieces of music have that, at least when they get to the full part. And whether you have 50 different instruments or 4 different instruments, you might have that exact same thing. So for example, even in like a 4-piece band, you might have something like on the melody. For melody, you have lead singer. For the counter melody, maybe a backup singer. You've got chords, which let's say is your electric guitar. Your bass is your bass guitar. Rhythmic texture, it might be your electric guitar. It might be the drum kit, a fill. And you've got percussive accents. Again, this is probably your drum kit. Although any of these other sounds can be percussive. So why does this matter? Well, I think one of the reasons why this matters is when you're thinking about writing and orchestrating and arranging a piece of music, and you're thinking, I want to use all the instruments, don't think I have to think of 40 unique things that need to happen. It's really not that complicated. You need to know what your basic chords are. You need to know what your melody is, what you're trying to accomplish harmonically. And then you need to know what you're trying to reinforce. What's the rhythm to sustain, that's trying to create momentum, or is it more than one rhythm? So knowing these core concepts, these very core musical elements that are behind your piece of music, is what you need to know first. And then it's just a matter of figuring out, okay, who all do I want to assign the melody to? And if I'm putting all these instruments on the melody, what's going to appropriately balance that out when I'm filling in the harmony with my chords and with my bass? And then it's just a matter of assigning roles and colors to those different elements as you think is appropriate and creative. So as full and as big as this sounds, and it could sound bigger if I did a couple different things, it's only a few different things that are actually happening. And I've found that in my own orchestration, in my own writing, the more aware I am mentally of what it is that I'm doing on a basic level, like what's my melody doing, what's my bass line doing, exactly what chords am I doing again, when I'm like cognizant of that mentally, then my orchestration is better. My arranging is more tight, and it can be more economical. One thing that is common for beginners to do, and in some ways I still consider myself a beginner, but I'm learning, is to overwrite, and specifically to have too many different kinds of harmonic movements or rhythmic movements going at once. And what ends up happening is, let's say you've got, because what I would do is I would start out, I put in my melody, and then I'd open up my next instrument, and I'm playing around, and I think, ooh, I really like this. I got to have that. So I'll have that little counter melody. And then I come up with something else, and like, ooh, I really like this little rhythmic motion in the violas. I'll put that in. And I'd have individual ideas that were cool on their own, or cool in context with the melody. But once you put all these different ideas together, if they're not complementing each other and working together, it's just too many ideas, and it ends up being such an indistinct musical statement that it's not interesting. Like your ear and your brain don't even know what you're listening for. So like knowing, like I have a bass line, I have one bass line, and whoever's on bass is on that bass line, and they're going to reinforce it and make it clear and make it strong. Okay, what's my chord? If I'm doing like a G major 6th chord, I want to make sure that everyone is kind of on board with reinforcing that harmonic statement. Even if it's arpeggios, okay, I want to make sure that the arpeggiated notes are reinforcing that harmonic statement. Okay, so just being aware of the basic elements of music in your composition is really, in a lot of ways, the foundation to creating some solid orchestration and good arrangement on top of those basics. So anyway, I think that's basically all I wanted to say about this piece of music. I hope this was enjoyable. I hope you learned a couple things. And if you're interested in Berlin Percussion, I don't know if this really gave you enough information to help you make a decision, but if you're curious, definitely go to the Orchestral Tools website and listen to some of the demos. There's a lot more information about the library there, but I have been using this library for about 5 years as my go-to orchestral library, and I've been using almost the identical orchestral percussion template ever since then. So I like it. It's great. But then again, to be fair, I'm not thinking about it a lot. I'm just kind of using what I already have set up, and it works great for my workflow. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me for this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.